Hello there. Now, every month my patrons select a subject that they would like me to talk about on my channel. And for this month they said, Lloyd, we want you to make a video about how the practice of shunning as practiced by Jehovah's Witnesses is unbiblical. It doesn't follow along with what the Bible says. Now, I've written a fair bit about this subject over the years, and my position has always been that you cannot justify Watchtower's shunning policy using the Bible. It's just too extreme. It's just too cruel. But when I was asked to talk about this subject in a video, I thought, well, maybe I need to take a step back. After all, I'm personally no longer religious. I no longer consider the Bible to be the infallible word of God. So it's quite conceivable that the Bible does contain some kind of rules or some kind of commands that could be interpreted justifiably the way Watchtower has interpreted them when it comes to how wrongdoers are supposed to be treated. So I approach this subject as objectively as possible, quite willing to do a complete U-turn and say to my patrons who asked me to make this video, actually, I've looked at the verses and you know what? This is just another area in which the Bible is being unethical or demanding things of people that are unreasonable. But what I did was I sat down with my Bible, with my New World Translation. There it is. And I just took some time. It was actually yesterday morning to do some proper research. And I took lots of notes as I was doing the research. And it got to the point where I had so many notes that I thought, actually, this needs to be a JW Survey article, because I've not written an article for JW Survey for quite some time now. I've mostly left it to Covert Fade and John Redwood to write articles. I've been focusing mainly on this channel, but I had so many notes and I found so many Bible verses that contradicted shunning as applied by Jehovah's Witnesses that I thought, no, this is more than I can handle in a video. This is really something that I need to put in written form on the internet. So basically, this video is to point you towards my JW Survey article. Here it is. The title of it is 14 Bible Verses that Dismantle Shunning as Practiced by Jehovah's Witnesses. And to explain both sides, I've started the article by listing, I think it's 6 verses that are prominently used by Watchtower to justify their policy of disfellowshipping and shunning. I won't go through all of those in this video because, quite frankly, they're there if you want to look at them. In this video, I just want to take you through a whistle-stop tour of the Bible verses I found that entirely debunk shunning as practiced by Jehovah's Witnesses. The first verse I found was in Matthew 5, verses 43 to 48. And without reading it all, it's where Jesus says, "Continue to love your enemies and to pray for those who persecute you. For if you love those loving you, what reward do you have? Are not also the tax collectors doing the same thing? And if you greet your brothers only, what extraordinary thing are you doing? Are not also the people of the nations doing the same thing?" And the point I make is that clearly it is impossible to love your enemy in any meaningful sense if you are refusing to speak to him, if you are treating him or her as though they don't exist. The next scripture I want to show you is also in Matthew chapter 9, verses 10 to 13, where it says, "Many tax collectors and sinners came and began dining with Jesus and his disciples. And when Jesus is confronted about this, he says, 'Healthy people do not need a physician, but those who are ill do. Go then and learn what this means. I want mercy and not sacrifice, for I came to call not righteous people, but sinners. And this was one of the extraordinary things that kind of hit me when I was doing this research, because you don't notice it when you're a JW. You're reading all these accounts of Jesus and you're repeatedly coming up against this exact scenario where the Jewish religious leaders are saying to Jesus, how dare you eat and spend time with tax collectors and sinners? And they are holding that against him. And just think for a moment about what that entails. We're talking about a recurring situation. I actually list a number of verses in my article where this exact situation is described. And bear in mind that Jesus was a Jew. He was practicing Judaism. He's recorded as giving a speech in a synagogue. He was part of or a member of the Jewish religion, which is why he was taken seriously as a teacher or as a rabbi, some called him. He was beholden to the Jewish religion and its rules. And in that religion, he had leaders who were basically ordering him to shun people. Leaders who were telling him, you shouldn't be speaking to that person because that person is a sinner. And instead, we repeatedly see Jesus not just speaking to sinners, not just speaking to tax collectors, but actually sitting down and socializing with them and sharing meals with them. And the point I make in my article is, if Jesus wanted to leave us with the impression that it's wrong to socialize with sinners and spend time with them, he did an awful job. Because the message he quite clearly gives us is that it's impossible to help someone who is going astray if you are blanking them out, if you're not even talking to them. So he went one step further and he socialized with them. And that continually irritated the Jewish leaders of his day. Then there's Matthew 18 verses 15 to 17. And I've had a lot to say about these verses recently on my channel because of the way Watchtower warps this verse in defense of its two-witness rule when it comes to the cover-up of child sex abuse. That's really a different issue. When you look at these verses, what you're seeing is Jesus giving his prescription for how wrongdoers are to be dealt with. And his solution is, you guys sort it out between yourselves. And he says, if your brother commits a sin, go and reveal his fault between you and him alone. He then says, if that doesn't work, bring in 2 or more others. And the ultimate worst case scenario, if you fail to persuade your brother that he's committed a sin, the worst case scenario is this. If he does not listen even to the congregation, let him be to you just as a man of the nations and as a tax collector. And what's interesting is we've already looked at or discussed verses in the Bible where Jesus is criticized for socializing with and eating with and spending time with tax collectors. So what he's saying here is, yeah, okay, this has broken down. It hasn't quite worked out. You're justified in no longer viewing him as a brother. He's now one of the outsiders. He's now a tax collector. But in the context of what we read elsewhere, that doesn't mean that this individual is to be completely ostracized and frozen out. You still get to talk to him or her or spend time with them. The next verse I want to show you is Luke chapter 6 verse 27, where Jesus says, but I say to you who are listening, continue to love your enemies, to do good to those hating you. And as I point out, it's impossible to love someone or do good to them if, again, you're completely freezing them out of the equation. But it's also worth mentioning that this verse is talking about enemies and people who hate you. And I argue in my article that actually most disfellowshipped people that I know do not hate their Jehovah's Witness family who are shunning them and do not view them as enemies. They would be quite happy to allow them to continue with their religious beliefs and just have that relationship back. So we're not even talking necessarily, when it comes to Jehovah's Witness shunning, about people who are out to get Jehovah's Witnesses, who are out to destroy their faith. They just, disfellowshipped people, certainly myself included, I can speak for myself in this, we just want to have our relationships back with those who we care about. And we're not overly concerned about dictating to them what their beliefs should be. We're happy to share what we think, what our opinions are. But if it has to be that we don't talk about religion and that we just share time together and talk about other things, I'm sure most disfellowshipped and shunned ex-witnesses would be happy to get by on that basis. The next verse I want to share with you is Luke 6:35-37, where Jesus says, "Continue to love your enemies and do good and to lend without hoping for anything back." And he says, "Continue being merciful, just as your Father is merciful. Moreover, stop judging, and you will by no means be judged. And stop condemning, and you will by no means be condemned. Keep on forgiving, and you will be forgiven." And this again emphasizes the merciful aspect of Jesus' teachings, the fact that he believed in forgiveness. These words about being merciful just as your Father is being merciful to you, and stop judging so that you're not judged, they remind you of, I think it's John chapter 8 verse 7, which is actually not included in the latest version of the New World Translation because it's considered spurious. But it says something like, "Let he who is without sin cast the first stone." And it's a similar idea that if you want people to show you mercy, and if you want people to show you forgiveness, who do you think you are going round judging other people, especially to the extent that witnesses judge other people by making them estranged from their family members? Also in Luke, you have the parable of the Good Samaritan, which is actually, even though I'm atheist, I consider the parable of the Good Samaritan to be the most beautiful passage in the Bible. I think it speaks to secular values. It shows that our value as people depends not on our background, not on our religion. It depends on whether we do good to each other, and that's something I can fully get behind. But there's also a message there about shunning, if you think about it, because before launching into that parable, what prompted Jesus to tell that story was someone questioning him and saying, "Who really is my neighbor?" Because Jesus had repeatedly been saying, you need to love your neighbor as yourself. Love your neighbor, love your neighbor. And he's asked, who is my neighbor? And Jesus gives this story in which a man is robbed, beaten, battered. He's lying there on the road in full view of passers-by, and the people who are walking past are not doing anything to help him are the people in his religion, the people from his community, the people who share his beliefs. They're the ones who are ignoring him. Then this heretic comes along, this apostate Samaritan who had deviant views, deviant religious beliefs from what Jews were supposed to have, and he goes above and beyond in helping the man. He dresses the wounds. He takes him to the inn. He gives the innkeeper whatever's needed to look after the guy and make sure he's safe and sheltered. And Jesus says, who of these three seems to you to have made himself neighbour to the man who fell victim to the robbers? He said, the one who acted mercifully toward him. Jesus then said to him, go and do the same yourself. Again, exquisite passage in the Bible, but the message there is that your neighbour can be someone who is an apostate, someone who has the complete opposite views that you have, and as I said before, Jesus was repeatedly saying, love thy neighbour. This runs entirely contrary to Watchtower's narrative when it comes to shunning and the way apostates are supposed to be treated. And also in Luke, you have the parable of the prodigal son, which, as I say in my article, the prodigal son story is dynamite to Watchtower's shunning policy. It completely eviscerates it. We start off with what prompts Jesus to start telling the story. He's again approached by the Pharisees and criticized for being friendly with sinners. They say, this man welcomes sinners and eats with them. And Jesus then says, you just don't get it, guys. I can't help people if I'm not speaking to them, if I'm not on their level, associating with them. And he gives the example of a man who has 100 sheep and one gets lost. He leaves the 99 sheep and he goes to find the one sheep that he's lost because it's that important to him that he helps this one sheep. He gives the example of the woman who loses the drachma coin and turns her house upside down to find the drachma coin. And having told those stories, he goes into the prodigal son story, which again is just an entirely, it's a counter narrative to Watchtower's shunning policy, which I think is why it's mentioned so little when Watchtower is discussing how wrongdoers are to be treated. We all know the story. The son asks his father for his inheritance. He then goes off and squanders his inheritance on a life of debauchery. Sure enough, the money runs out. He's left with nothing. He ends up living with pigs somewhere. And at that point, he makes the decision, you know what, I might as well return to my father and ask if I can at least work as one of his hired men. Because that's the situation I'm in at the moment. It would at least be good for me to be working for my father. And so he gets up, he goes to his father, and it says, while he was still a long way off, he's a long way off, his father caught sight of him and was moved with pity, and he ran and embraced him and tenderly kissed him. The prodigal son's father wasn't interested in whether his son was repentant or not. He was just glad his son was alive and his son had returned. That was all that mattered. That's entirely the opposite of Watchtower's shunning policy. There's also another interesting feature of this story, which I discuss a little bit. I mention it in the article. There's a debate to be had as to whether the prodigal son would actually have been disfellowshipped by a Jehovah's Witness elder judicial committee if this were a true story happening now. Because there's this thing called worldly sadness. And when elders are deliberating over a wrongdoer, they will ask, well, what are the works befitting repentance? How do we know that this person is repentant? How do their actions tell us what's going on in their minds? And if someone is only expressing sadness or regret over the consequences of what they've done, then this would be called worldly sadness. And even though they may be sorry, they're still disfellowshipped because they're not properly or sufficiently concerned about how Jehovah feels about it all. And I believe there's a strong argument to be had that if the prodigal son were dragged before a judicial committee, he would be disfellowshipped on grounds of worldly sadness, because it was only when he ran out of money that he thinks, oh, I'd better go back. It wasn't before he ran out of money that he thought, what I'm doing is wrong, I've got to stop this. Now, when you read the verse, he does say, let me see, Father, I have sinned. Sorry, I will get up and travel to my father and say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy of being called your son. Make me as one of your hired men. And I guess a Jehovah's Witness would read that and say, well, there you go. He's at least saying that he's concerned about God and what God thinks about his actions. But again, elders wouldn't just look at what someone's saying. They would look at what they're doing. And they would ask, when was it exactly that he returned? Was it before he ran out of money? Or was it after he'd run out of money and didn't have any choice but to come crawling back? So that's another debate. I'll leave you to make your own decision, but it's just something interesting to think about. Now we move out of the Gospels and into the writings of Paul. And we go to 2 Corinthians 2, verses 1 to 7, where Paul says, I wrote what I did so that when I came, I may not be saddened by those over whom I ought to rejoice. And he says, now if anyone has caused sadness, he has saddened not me, but all of you to an extent, not to be too harsh in what I say. You're reading this thinking, what's he talking about? Why is Paul talking about people being saddened by what he's said? Bear in mind, this is the second letter to the Corinthians, and then it all becomes clear. He says, this rebuke given by the majority is sufficient for such a man. You're thinking, what do you mean, such a man? What kind of man? Now you should instead kindly forgive and comfort him, so that he may not be overwhelmed by excessive sadness. Paul is talking about what he'd written in the first letter to the Corinthians, specifically in the 5th chapter, where he spells out his recommendations on how wrongdoers are to be treated. And it's these exact recommendations that Watchtower takes and exaggerates and kind of mutates into its shunning policy. And I found this fascinating, returning to what Paul was writing with fresh eyes, without interpreting things necessarily as a Jehovah's Witness would interpret them, and reading this part about excessive sadness, because that was actually something that I remember learning about as a witness. The principle was, okay, you've disfellowshipped someone, you don't want them to get to a point where they are so sad, where they are so depressed, that they're just no longer even interested in restoring their relationship with Jehovah. And that was the understanding of this verse. But what's interesting is, you look at this and think, hang on, Paul wasn't writing this before his words in 1 Corinthians 5. He was writing them after. He's saying, listen, I get it, that what I said previously may have given rise to an enormous amount of sadness. And his solution, and this isn't something we even considered as witnesses, he says, this rebuke given by the majority is sufficient for such a man. I checked in all of the other translations with this verse. In every translation, Practically, it says majority. It's enough that the majority of a congregation rebuke a wrongdoer. It doesn't have to be every single member of the congregation that rebukes a wrongdoer. That alone completely dismantles Watchtower's entire premise when it comes to the way wrongdoers are to be treated, because they insist that everyone, every single person, including the family members, everyone has to observe and respect the decision of the elders, the disfellowshipping principle. If you don't respect it, you're being disloyal, and actually you are frustrating the work of the elders. You are making it harder for that person to return. Here in 2 Corinthians, writing about what he's already said on this subject, Paul says, you know what? It's okay if it's just the majority of the congregation that do this. Let's not go overboard, people. Let's not cause excessive sadness. Let's not basically bully someone. There needs to be some element of mercy extended here. And again, I read that. It just blew my mind. And I actually found myself with a little bit more respect for Paul, because since losing my religion, I've come to really, I think hate is a strong word. I feel a great deal of contempt for a lot of what Paul wrote, especially when it comes to the treatment of women, especially when it comes to the way homosexuals are to be treated, the way they're to be looked down on. I used to think of Paul as this amazing role model, this champion of truth. I now think of him as basically a bigot, a deluded, misguided person. But I can at least look upon what he wrote about shunning and think there's another side to Paul that I haven't been shown. He did have a heart for people who were being dealt with judicially, and we see it there in just this brief passage at the beginning of 2 Corinthians. Then in his letter to the Colossians, Colossians 3 verses 13 and 14, Paul says, continue putting up with one another and forgiving one another freely, even if anyone has a cause for complaint against another. Just as Jehovah freely forgave you, you must also do the same. Again, it's that principle of let he who is without sin cast the first stone. Who are you to expect forgiveness if you're not forgiving others freely? How can you really be putting up with someone? How can you be freely forgiving them if you're not even acknowledging their existence? Another brilliant verse I found was 1 Thessalonians 4 verses 3 to 8 and verses 9 to 12. Paul says, no one should go beyond proper limits and take advantage of his brother in this matter, because Jehovah exacts punishment for all these things, just as we told you previously and also strongly warned you. He says, make it your aim to live quietly and to mind your own business and to work with your hands, just as we instructed you, so that you may walk decently in the eyes of people outside and not need anything. And this was just, again, it's the exact counter-narrative to what elders do. Elders don't mind their own business. They don't look upon punishment as something that it's Jehovah who exacts punishment. They think that punishment is something that they are responsible for dispensing, and they think that everything is their business, to the point where when it's a judicial committee situation and they're speaking to someone who has been involved in some kind of sexual misconduct or something that can be perceived as sexual misconduct, they're not afraid to ask very inappropriate probing questions of a sexually explicit nature, how is that minding your own business? The way elders conduct themselves, honestly, entirely contradicts what Paul is saying here. And what's interesting, and we'll come back to this, it's very obvious when you're reading Paul's writings that he firmly believed that it was God who would do the punishing. We don't need to punish people in the congregation because God's going to do that. Jesus is going to take care of it, he says somewhere else. Paul really believed that punishment was for, as I say in the article, for the hereafter rather than for the here and now. And that, again, is the opposite of what Watchtower teaches. Watchtower very much believes that it's in the here and now that wrongdoers need to be punished. Also in 1 Thessalonians, you have chapter 5, verses 14 and 15, where Paul says, "Warn the disorderly, speak consolingly to those who are depressed, support the weak, be patient toward all. See that no one repays injury for injury to anyone." How are you supporting the weak? How are you consoling the depressed? How are you being patient toward all? By breaking people apart from their families, by weaponizing someone's family relationships against them so that they are ostracized, so that they are made to endure an unbearable psychological punishment against them. Again, it completely contradicts Watchtower's shunning narrative. Whereas Paul says, return injury for injury to no one, Watchtower says, we're definitely going to return injury for injury to wrongdoers. They've injured us. They've broken one of our rules. We're going to injure them. We're going to separate them from their family. Then we move on to 2 Thessalonians chapter 3, verses 6 to 15. I'm going to read this and you're going to think, that doesn't seem to be speaking against shunning, quite frankly, Lloyd. It says, "Now we are giving you instructions, brothers, in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, to withdraw from every brother who is walking disorderly and not according to the tradition that you received from us." Again, you're reading it thinking, that sounds like shunning to me. And what's interesting is that when Watchtower reads this verse, they don't consider it to be describing disfellowshipping. They instead say, well, this verse is talking about a different procedure called marking. Marking is basically a form of soft shunning, where if someone's doing something that isn't really too serious, it's just not exactly what they're supposed to do as a witness, but it's not what would be considered a gross sin, the elders will give a talk that without naming the individual spells out what it is that they're doing, so that the congregation who's hearing the talk thinks, this person's done something they're not supposed to do. I'm not allowed to socialize with them or do anything social with them. I can still talk to them at the meeting. I can still talk to them when we go out in the preaching work. I can't go to the cinema with them. I can't go for a coffee with them. All socializing with them has to end until I see the elders resuming their association with that individual. Then I'm allowed to do the same. So it's again this entire new concept that Watchtower has invented. But the reason why they've done that is because when you get to the end of this passage, what it's describing isn't anything like as severe as the shunning that you would expect for a disfellowshipped person. It says, "But if anyone is not obedient to our word through this letter," that's an important use of words, this letter, I'll come back to that, "keep this one marked and stop associating with him so that he may become ashamed. And yet do not consider him an enemy, but continue admonishing him as a brother." Clearly, if you're still admonishing someone as a brother, then you are not shunning them, or at least you're not full on shunning them. You're still allowed to speak to them. It's just that according to this, your association is limited. Now, what's interesting is that when you compare 2 Thessalonians 3 with 1 Corinthians 5, which Watchtower uses to justify its disfellowshipping, what you find is that Paul is describing the same problem of how do we deal with someone who's doing stuff we don't like? How do we deal with someone who is going against the congregation and causing trouble, or basically just dragging everyone else down? What measures do we implement to dissuade them from doing that? And in 1 Corinthians, you have this this wording that can easily be misconstrued as meaning full-on shunning. And then in 2 Corinthians, you have Paul saying, whoa, just hold on a minute there, guys. It's okay if it's just a majority who's rebuking the individual. And then when it comes to the Thessalonian congregation, he's saying, you know what, you should still be able to talk to the person and admonish him as a brother. Watchtower has seen the difference between those two sets of instructions and parsed them into two different situations, when really they're talking about the same thing. And to highlight that, you have this wording that I drew your attention to, where Paul says, if anyone is not obedient to our word through this letter meaning 2 Thessalonians. What's in 2 Thessalonians? If you look at only the previous chapter, chapter 2, Paul is talking about the man of lawlessness, which Watchtower equates to the Antichrist. We're talking the Antichrist here. We're talking about someone who denounces Jesus. Someone who stands in opposition and exalts himself above every so-called God or object of worship. Paul is including an apostate and a denier of Jesus, the Antichrist, in his recommendations to stop associating but continue admonishing as a brother. That, again, is the entire opposite of Watchtower's narrative. Watchtower says, if you're an apostate, if you don't agree with our religious beliefs, you are mentally diseased, you are eating at the table of demons, we don't want to have anything to do with you. And yet here in 2 Thessalonians 3, Paul has a far more relaxed approach where he's saying, yeah, of course you wouldn't associate with someone who's doing that, but you can at least admonish them as a brother. Maybe in time they'll correct their course. And the reason why Paul was so laid back about this was, again, because he didn't believe in punishment in the here and now. He believed in punishment in the hereafter. And when Paul's talking about the man of lawlessness, the Antichrist, as 2 John describes such a person, he says that it's down to Jesus to do away with such a person by the manifestation of his presence. In other words, we can let this person do what they're doing because it's Jesus they have to answer to. It's Jesus who's going to do away with this person if they don't correct their course. In the meantime, we wouldn't want to associate with such a person, but it doesn't mean that we freeze all contact. We can still try and appeal to them. We can still try to admonish them, which again does not remotely describe Watchtower's way of doing things. I also love what Paul says in 1 Timothy 5 verse 8. Certainly if anyone does not provide for those who are his own, and especially for those who are members of his household, he has disowned the faith and is worse than a person without faith. So if you're not providing materially or emotionally for a family member, this is saying you are worse than a person without faith. Now, don't get me wrong. I no longer have faith. I no longer think of faith as something that we should have, because faith to me is just belief without evidence. I don't think it's a virtue to be able to believe things without having those things proven to you. But at least from the perspective of a religious person, you'd be horrified if someone told you, you are worse than a person without faith. And here Paul is saying to Timothy that if you don't provide for your family, and we can include, I believe, emotionally providing for your family, you are worse than a person without faith. Again, how does that fit in to Watchtower's shunning narrative of breaking families apart and telling believing witnesses you don't get to speak to your family member if he or she is disfellowshipped? And the final verse I want to show you is from Hebrews 10 verses 26 to 31. You're not maybe going to be blown away by this. It doesn't seem on face value to be addressing shunning per se, but there's a reason why I've included it in my 14. It basically is where Paul says, "For we know the one who said, 'Vengeance is mine, I will repay,' and again Jehovah will judge his people. It is a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God." Now, the reason why I've included this is, first of all, it's again Paul saying, we don't need to punish. We don't need to have this elaborate system, this elaborate judicial system where we break families apart if they don't do what we're telling them to do, because Jehovah says, vengeance is mine. It's for Jehovah to do the judging. It's for Jehovah to do the punishment. But this verse in Hebrews 10 was included in a 1947 Awake article, which I've already talked about on this channel. If you've not watched my stuff before, I might as well mention it again. It's the January 8th, 1947 Awake article titled, "Are You Also Excommunicated?" Bear in mind, Jehovah's Witnesses only started their disfellowshipping practice in 1952, and it wasn't until 1981 that they made it a captive organization where you couldn't even formally disassociate without being shunned. But way back in 1947, there was no disfellowshipping procedure, and so Watchtower had the freedom to attack the Catholic Church for its excommunication practice. It described excommunication as an instrument of ecclesiastical power and secular tyranny, not without pagan influence. It said that excommunicating people might be pagan, and it said that excommunication is altogether foreign to Bible teachings. And when arguing biblically that excommunication was wrong, they quote Hebrews 10, 26 to 31, where Paul says, God is saying, vengeance is mine, I will repay. It's not down to us to punish people. God's got that covered. So those are my 14 Bible verses that debunk shunning as practiced by Jehovah's Witnesses. Quite honestly, and this is not something I say in the article, that was what I got from like a morning of research. I said to Deanna, probably if I'd spent like a day or 2 days scouring the Bible, I probably could have come up with more verses along those lines, more verses in the Bible that completely contradict Watchtower's shunning policy. That's how unbiblical it is. So when Jehovah's Witnesses say, oh, well, shunning is God's command, it's in the Bible, you get to say to them, that's just simply not true. Because the Bible says you shouldn't judge people. Jesus was repeatedly called out by the Jewish religious leaders for being friendly with sinners, for socializing with sinners, for eating with sinners, and we're supposed to be imitating Jesus. And Paul, when he wrote what he wrote in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, in his very next letter, he's saying, you know what? Let's not get carried away here. It's enough if it's just the majority of a congregation that's rebuking the wrongdoer. Let's not create a situation where someone is excessively sad. And as we know, excessive sadness is putting it mildly when it comes to the awful impact of Watchtower's shunning policy. We're talking depression. We're talking people even committing suicide due to the way their families have been turned against them. And as I say, their relationships with people they care about have been twisted and weaponized against them. It's completely immoral, and yes, we can say unbiblical. But again, I would urge you to check out my JW survey article. I will put a link below so that you can do that. It's where I explain things in maybe a little bit better order or in a bit better detail. There's also links on there for you to look up that 1947 Awake article I talked about. And hopefully, especially if you are a Jehovah's Witness, or you're still kind of holding a candle for some of the Jehovah's Witness beliefs, check that out, and hopefully you'll start to understand that witnesses really are being lied to and exploited in this area. But before I go, I just want to thank my patrons for asking me to talk about this subject, for setting me down this road of research. It's been a fascinating experiment to return to this book after so long, and again to do so as a non-believer, as someone who no longer thinks this is God's inspired word. It's nonetheless been interesting to start arguing along theological grounds again. So that's been very interesting, and thank you to my patrons for suggesting this topic. I hope you have enjoyed this video, and as always, thank you for watching.